Picture yourself walking through a forest. Suddenly, birds burst upward out of the branches. A deer locks eyes with you, its gaze wide with alarm, then takes off as though it just remembered somewhere urgent to be. Nearby, a squirrel darts forward a few paces, halts, darts again, halts again, caught in what looks like a small panic simply because you happen to exist. Meanwhile, you're just standing there in your hiking boots, calmly chewing on a granola bar. So what's really happening in these moments? Why would creatures armed with claws, venom, horns, raw speed, and even the ability to shed their own tails be so terrified of us? Soft, slow-moving, mostly bald primates who struggle to climb 2 flights of stairs without getting winded. The explanation runs much deeper than most people realize. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a startled squirrel the same way again. Let's go back to where this all began. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. This fear of humans didn't originate recently. It didn't begin with the invention of guns, or farming, or even fire. It stretches back millions of years. Researchers refer to this as the landscape of fear, the idea that prey species don't merely react to predators in the moment. Instead, their whole existence is organized around the constant possibility that a predator might be near. Where they eat, where they sleep, where they drink, and when they move around, all of it gets shaped by the need to avoid dying. And for an extremely long stretch of time, early humans were very much part of that equation. Our ancestors hunted constantly. Paleolithic people were what's known as persistence hunters, meaning they lacked the raw speed to chase down prey directly. But they had something arguably worse: the ability to keep moving for hours under the hot sun until the animal simply gave out from exhaustion. If you were a gazelle spotting some odd 2-legged figure jogging steadily in the distance, that sight alone would have been deeply alarming. Over time, animals learned this lesson, not as individuals, but as generations. Those that fled from human silhouettes lived to reproduce, while those that didn't often ended up as meals. Repeat that pattern across thousands of generations, and the result is animals whose instinctive fear of humans is essentially built into their genetic programming. It isn't something each animal learns on its own. It's a survival strategy passed down through the species, sometimes called the super predator theory. Now here's where things get genuinely interesting, and even a little flattering. Back in 2016, researchers from the University of Western Ontario published findings that made a striking claim. They argued that humans function as what they called the super predator, meaning other predators fear us even more than they fear one another. To test this, they played recorded sounds to wild animals, not roaring lions or howling wolves, but simply human voices having an ordinary conversation, the kind you'd overhear at a bus stop. The outcome was striking. Mountain lions bolted at more than double the rate they did when hearing other predators. Bobcats, deer, skunks, and possums all reacted more strongly to human voices than to any other perceived threat. Even predators with no natural enemies of their own still showed the same fear response to the sound of people talking. Consider that for a second. A mountain lion, an apex predator capable of killing deer without effort, fleeing simply because it overheard someone chatting about their weekend. Why would that happen? Because even top predators carry a kind of inherited memory that humans are dangerous. We've hunted them too. We've pushed them from their territory. We've killed them whenever they got too close to livestock. Over generations, even animals at the very top of the food chain came to associate humans with danger. It's not just that we're predators, it's that we're unpredictable predators. And in the animal world, unpredictability might be the scariest trait there is. Let's dig into why that unpredictability matters so much. Most predators operate on recognizable patterns. Wolves tend to hunt around dawn and dusk. Crocodiles wait near water's edge. Hawks target small rodents in open fields. Prey species have spent millions of years learning to read these patterns, and that knowledge is often what keeps them alive. A deer that knows where wolves typically hunt can simply avoid that territory. A fish that knows when herons feed can stay in deeper water during those hours. But humans don't follow any single pattern. We hunt in daylight and after dark. We hunt alone and in groups. We rely on fire, traps, spears, bows, rifles, even drones. We hunt on land, in the water, and from the air. We go after animals we intend to eat and animals we have no interest in eating at all. We pursue creatures that pose danger and creatures that are completely harmless. From an animal's point of view, there's simply no consistent formula to us. We're a variable they can't solve for. And when a threat can't be predicted or solved, the only sensible strategy left is constant, maximum avoidance. There's actually a term in behavioral ecology called predator recognition, describing how prey animals sort threats into categories. Most predators fit neatly into familiar boxes, like big cats, birds of prey, or canines, and animals develop specific, instinctive responses matched to each category. Humans, though, don't fit cleanly into any of those boxes. We have an unusual scent, an odd way of moving, strange vocal sounds, and then, confusingly, we might spend 20 minutes calmly tossing bread to birds in a park. We break whatever pattern recognition system an animal's brain relies on, and that inconsistency is deeply unsettling to instinctive threat detection. But then, what about animals that clearly aren't afraid of us at all? That's a fair point to raise, since you've almost certainly seen city pigeons that seem unwilling to budge no matter how close you get. You've probably watched raccoons stare directly at you while rifling through your trash. Seagulls will snatch a chip right out of your hand while maintaining unbroken eye contact, almost as a show of dominance. So what explains that behavior? This comes down to something called habituation, one of the most important concepts in the study of animal behavior. When an animal is repeatedly exposed to a stimulus, in this case humans, without suffering any negative consequences, its fear response gradually fades. Essentially, the animal's brain concludes that this recurring presence hasn't caused harm, so continuing to waste energy, being afraid of it, no longer makes sense, and the perceived threat level gets downgraded. Urban wildlife undergoes this shift across generations. City pigeons have coexisted with humans for so long that the instinct to fear us has largely disappeared from the population. There's no survival benefit in fleeing from people who are literally handing out bread every day. The same applies to crows. Which brings up one particularly fascinating case. Crows don't just get used to humans. They actually learn to recognize specific human faces. Research has shown that crows remember individuals who have wronged them in the past and will continue to harass those particular people for years afterward. They'll even enlist other crows to join in, and they teach their offspring which humans should be considered dangerous. So rather than simply losing their fear of us, crows have essentially built a form of ongoing surveillance culture directed at humans, keeping mental records of who to watch out for. Depending on how recently you've upset a crow, that fact is either delightful or genuinely unsettling. Now let's turn to the island experiment that reshaped how scientists understand all of this. One of the clearest pieces of evidence explaining human-related fear in animals comes from a kind of natural experiment that unfolded in ocean environments and isolated islands. In places where humans have either never set foot or have been absent for extended stretches, animals display almost no fear reaction whatsoever. The Galapagos Islands remain the best-known case. When Darwin landed there in the 1830s, he was genuinely puzzled because the animals simply didn't react to him. In his notes, he described sitting beside birds that made no attempt to fly away, and even pushing iguanas into the ocean, only to watch them swim calmly back and settle beside him again. Marine iguanas, blue-footed boobies, and giant tortoises showed no urge to flee and no apparent concern at all. A similar pattern appears in parts of Antarctica, where penguins show virtually no fear of people. They'll walk directly up to researchers, examine their gear closely, and sometimes attempt to make off with equipment. Scientists working in the field often find themselves having to gently fend off curious penguins drawn to their cameras and backpacks. In marine reserves, where fishing has been prohibited for decades, similar shifts happen with fish, as populations gradually stop fearing divers. Researchers have observed fish in these protected zones swimming toward humans out of curiosity, while fish just outside those boundaries, in unprotected waters, flee immediately. The takeaway from all this is remarkably clear. Fear of humans isn't a built-in default setting. It's something acquired through lived experience. When humans stop posing a threat, whether because they were never present in the first place or because hunting has ceased, that fear can fade away, sometimes in only a handful of generations. Which tells us the fear isn't really about who we are, it's about what we actually do. Now consider what this fear does at the level of entire ecosystems. Since it's far more than a curious quirk of animal psychology, it reshapes the natural world itself. Scientists studying wolves in Yellowstone National Park stumbled onto a surprising discovery. After wolves were reintroduced there in 1995, the deer population didn't simply shrink in number, it shifted in behavior. Deer stopped grazing openly in the valleys. They avoided riverbanks. They altered their movement patterns and spent far less time in exposed, vulnerable spots. Because deer weren't overgrazing those areas anymore, vegetation started regrowing. Riverbanks eroded less, which changed the paths rivers took. Trees returned. Bird species came back. Fish populations improved as the streams became healthier overall. All of this stemmed from the fact that wolves made deer afraid, and that fear alone, not just direct hunting, drove sweeping ecological change. Ecologists refer to this as a landscape of fear, and it's considered one of the most powerful hidden forces shaping nature. Now apply the same logic to human presence. Whenever people show up consistently in an area, whether hunting or simply being around, that same fear-driven effect takes hold. Animals adjust how they move, avoid certain zones at certain times, and change their feeding habits. Nocturnal behavior tends to increase, since darkness offers cover from human activity. Species that used to be active during daylight hours begin shifting toward the night, specifically to reduce contact with people. A 2018 study published in the journal Science found that animal populations across 6 continents had grown noticeably more nocturnal, specifically in response to human presence. Mammals that once moved about during the day were shifting their schedules to nighttime, not necessarily because their habitat had been destroyed, but simply because humans were nearby. Just the presence of people alone was enough to rearrange the daily rhythms of wildlife across the entire planet. We're not merely predators in the traditional sense. We're functioning as a global ecological force, capable of altering when animals choose to be active. Let's address something people would rather not think about: the possibility that animals fear us partly because we smell terrible to them. Human scent carries a genuinely strong chemical signature in the wild. We're coated in a mix of synthetic substances: deodorant, soap, laundry detergent, lingering food smells, plastic residue, exhaust fumes, and other compounds we probably don't want to examine too closely, all of which are completely foreign to natural ecosystems. Even setting aside all those artificial elements and considering only natural human body odor, that scent remains powerful and unmistakable on its own. Predator urine is routinely used as a deterrent in wildlife management, precisely because animals interpret scent as a primary warning sign. And studies show human scent triggers a very similar reaction. When researchers placed strips soaked in human sweat near wildlife cameras, the drop in animal activity matched what happened when strips soaked in mountain lion urine were used instead. Take a moment to consider that. Just existing and giving off the ordinary smell of being alive makes you roughly as intimidating to local wildlife as an actual mountain lion. Some people are already aware of this fact and have simply embraced it as part of their identity, which is fine. Now, a reasonable question follows. If animals are this afraid of us, why do some still attack? The answer nearly always comes down to the same explanation. These attacks aren't driven by aggression, they're driven by desperation. Most dangerous encounters between humans and animals fall into one of 3 categories. First, the animal feels trapped with no way to escape. Second, the animal is a mother defending her young. Third, the animal has been forced into close contact with people because its habitat has been destroyed, leaving it under severe stress. In nearly every instance, the attack functions as a last resort rather than a hunting strategy. It's a defensive reaction, not a predatory one. Bears illustrate this well. By nature, bears strongly avoid humans, and given any reasonable chance, a bear will simply leave the area. The issue arises as human development steadily encroaches on bear territory, shrinking the space bears have to retreat into. With fewer options, less available food, and more forced encounters with people, an already stressed bear that gets suddenly surprised at close range reacts the way almost any animal, humans included, would react under similar pressure, by going on the offensive. There are genuine exceptions to this general rule, and polar bears stand out as one. They're among the rare large predators that will actively pursue humans as prey. Even this makes more sense once you consider that polar bears evolved in an environment essentially free of other large predators, with very limited prey options, and nothing in their evolutionary history to teach them to be wary of upright, bipedal creatures. They simply never received the signal the rest of the animal kingdom did. What happens, then, when animals encounter humans for the very first time? Perhaps the strongest evidence for all of this comes from first contact scenarios, moments when explorers or researchers meet animals that have had absolutely no prior exposure to people. The pattern that emerges is remarkably consistent. There's no fear at all. Historical records from Pacific voyages describe sailors approaching birds that had never seen a human before and simply picking them up by hand. Early written descriptions of the dodo, a species now famously extinct largely because of this very trait, describe an animal so completely unafraid of humans that hunting it required almost no effort at all, since the birds would actually walk toward the hunters. Sailors at the time assumed the birds were simply stupid. In reality, they weren't stupid, they had just never been taught to be afraid. This same pattern shows up in more recent situations too. When researchers make contact with isolated animal populations, certain remote insect species, or deep-sea creatures brought to the surface for the first time, the fear response is either absent entirely or extremely weak. This gives us a rare glimpse into what the world may have looked like before humans became such an overwhelming presence. Not a world free of danger altogether, but one where danger didn't move on two legs and didn't seem to arrive from every direction at once. That leads into what might be called an evolutionary arms race. And here's the uncomfortable philosophical point it eventually leads to. The fear animals show toward us isn't some kind of overreaction or mistake. It's an accurate assessment of reality. Humans have driven hundreds of species to extinction. We've collapsed populations through hunting. We've transformed or wiped out more than half of the planet's natural habitats. We've reshaped the global climate itself. In a very real sense, animals that fear us are statistically making the correct call. But there's a twist here as well. Precisely because animals flee, hide, and avoid us out of fear, we often fail to grasp the true scale of our impact. Wildlife effectively disappears from view. We visit natural spaces and encounter fewer and fewer animals, and we mistakenly read that absence as a sign that nature is thriving. In truth, the lack of visible wildlife often reflects flight rather than peace. That fear response actually makes it easier for us to overlook the damage we're causing. And there's a particularly harsh consequence within this landscape of fear. It also works directly against conservation efforts. Animals that are deeply afraid of humans become much harder to study, protect, or assist. Fear acts like a barrier, keeping researchers at a distance and preventing animals from benefiting from the very protections meant to help them. Ironically, the most traumatized wildlife populations often end up being the least accessible ones. Still, let's close on a somewhat more encouraging note, because this next part is genuinely one of the more compelling developments in current wildlife research. Scientists are discovering more and more that, under the right circumstances, meaning steady, non-threatening human presence, reliable food sources, and reduced hunting pressure, animals are capable of readapting to humans in surprisingly short amounts of time. Mountain gorilla tourism initiatives in Rwanda and Uganda have tracked gorilla groups that once fled at the mere sight of rangers, but over just a few years of careful, respectful habituation, began tolerating, and in some cases appearing to welcome, the presence of human observers nearby. This shift didn't happen because the gorillas forgot their instinctive caution, but because they were given enough consistent, positive experiences to revise their expectations, learning that these specific humans, in this specific setting, were reliably safe and produced no harmful outcomes. Fear, in other words, is something learned, and learning is reversible in either direction. In rewilded regions, areas where hunting and human disturbance have been deliberately removed, animals gradually return to their natural behavior patterns. Daytime grazing resumes. Use of open, exposed areas returns. The tense, constantly alert behavior typical of heavily hunted populations begins to relax. This shows that the landscape of fear isn't a fixed, permanent condition. It can be undone, but only if humans consistently and reliably demonstrate that they aren't a threat, which, given our history, is no small undertaking. Ultimately, animals fear us because we spent millions of years earning that reputation. We are the most adaptable, relentless, unpredictable, and ecologically dominant predator this planet has ever seen. We hunt across every continent, in every climate, at every hour of the day or night. We don't conform to any pattern that an animal's brain has evolved to recognize and respond to. We've driven species to extinction on virtually every landmass we've ever inhabited. Simply by being present, we reshape the ecosystems around us. So when a squirrel appears to be having a small breakdown on your lawn, it isn't being overly dramatic. It's running an inherited survival program that's been fine-tuned across hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary history. It has no way of knowing that all you're actually doing is eating a granola bar and enjoying a walk through nature. But here's the encouraging part. The very same intelligence and adaptability that made humans so frightening to the rest of the animal kingdom, our creativity, our flexibility, our overall capability, is also exactly what gives us the power to choose a different path. In places where humans have proven, over time, to be consistently safe, animals don't flee and don't hide. They go about their lives openly, in daylight, without needing to burn enormous amounts of energy staying constantly on guard. That kind of world already exists, if only in fragments, in wildlife reserves, on certain islands, in places where this long-running experiment has had enough time to play out. The landscape of fear isn't set in stone. It reflects behavior, and behavior can change over time. The real question that remains is whether we're willing to make the effort to earn that change.